According to Nietzsche, there are two different types of people in the world: those who want to know and those who want to believe. You have arrived at the crossroads of mind and matter. The Midnight Academy with Dr. Heather Lynn.
Matt Lewis is one of the nation's leading experts in career transition for members of the military community. He coaches individuals on their transition efforts and advises employers on hiring programs designed to successfully assimilate this valuable talent pool. He is the author of the award-winning and best-selling HarperCollins book, Mission Transition, a practical guide for veterans in career transition, their families, and their employers. His second book, Hiring Veterans, is a practical guide for the organizational leaders on how to build programs to successfully assimilate veterans and military spouses. Matt serves as the Veteran Transition Assistance Officer for his West Point class, is a national speaker on the U.S. Chamber's Hiring Our Heroes program, serves J.P. Morgan Chase's External Advisory Council for Military and Veterans Affairs, and advises the Board of Soldiers to Sidelines. During active commissioned service in the U.S. Army, Matt served in the Southwest Asia Combat Theater and in the 194th Separate Armored Brigade. During reserve commissioned service, Matt served on the staff of the Army's Office of the Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations and commanded multiple regions around the country for the U.S. Military Academy's Admissions Office. He is a retired lieutenant colonel from the U.S. Army and serves on the Service Academy Nominating Committee for his local congressman. Matt holds an MBA in Operations and Finance from the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University, a BS in Mechanical Engineering from West Point, and is a graduate of the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. He is also a certified Lean Six Sigma Master Black Belt and holds the ASCM organization's Certified Supply Chain Professional designation. Matt is also the president of Purepost, the optimal means for matching talent to available roles in the U.S. economy. He previously led global strategy and transformation projects at Deloitte, the largest professional services firm in the world. Prior to Deloitte, Matt held global operational, production, and quality roles in multiple divisions of both General Electric and Procter & Gamble. For more information, you can visit his website at www.matthewjlewis.com. That's www.matthewjlewis.com. First off, I do want to thank you so much for coming on. We did have a little meeting before, and so we've met a few times off air and on air. And so I want to thank you so much for coming and presenting the information that you're about to present. I'm going to just go ahead and let you sort of take the floor a bit, because you really have a message, and I'm going to let you sort of give that message, and then I'll maybe interject with questions. But you're so good at presenting, and that's one of the reasons I'm so glad that you are the presenter of this information. So, if you want to tell the audience a little bit about yourself and, what it is that you are trying to get across to people with your two books.
Sure.
You have a new one coming out, but it's sort of like a bookend to the other one.
Exactly right. First of all, Heather, thank you for having me back. I appreciate your patience and willingness to do a double take here. So I really appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. For those of you unfamiliar with me, I'm Matt Lewis. I'll just take it very quickly chronologically through my background. I'm a 1991 West Point graduate. I spent some time on active duty, many more years in the reserves. All told, 25 years in uniform of some sort. I used graduate school as my transition vehicle and various stints through the corporate world. You can find all those entities on my profile on LinkedIn. All told, 25 years and counting in the corporate space as well. I've kind of pivoted my life's purpose in better part of the past decade to focus on eliminating the civil military divide in the country. And we can get into defining precisely what that is. But I'm attacking that difficulty, that challenge from three different paths, three different avenues. The first, you'd mentioned my books. You can see them over my shoulder here. I'll just hold up some copies. The first book is Mission Transition. It's the most awarded book of its kind. It's a practical guide to help our service members find full employment in optimal career fields. And by the way, I'm squarely focused on employment. It's very purposeful. Several reasons for that. Um, Employment, if you get a service member fully employed in an optimal career field from the outset, once they depart active duty, studies show, I ground all of my facts here and figures and studies and statistics. It's not hearsay or opinion. The studies show that they will more than double over the course of their career, their earnings, rate of retention, job satisfaction. It's incredibly important. But more so than that, it helps to assuage any of the other issues associated with other social determinants of health. So to include suicidality, which has the rates of which have more than doubled over the past decade in the post 9/11 cohort. So it's incredibly important. But that's just one half of the divide, as it were. The other half, and what I'm doing here to tackle it, this is the book that Heather mentioned, comes out on Labor Day, Hiring Veterans, Practical Guide for Organizational Leaders. And I use that agnostic term purposefully to indicate for-profit, nonprofit, large company, small company, academic institutions, governmental organizations. And the book is intended to enable them, it's a practical guide to enable them to build programs to bring on, to assimilate veterans and military spouses, this incredibly valuable talent pool that most people don't understand, realize is there, or if they do, don't properly know how to utilize them. Again, that part of the nature of the civil military divide. But even if you're successful with those two efforts, if you will, what still exists from an employment standpoint is a lack of a warm handoff, as I call it, from your last duty station and the community in which you settle. And that's where my work with Purepost comes into play, my new day job, as it were. I'm president of the company. What we do is match supply and demand of talent in the country with a specialty focus on members of the military community. We serve the entire economy, but basically everyone on the team has a military background, and that's kind of been our initial passion. What we're able to do, without going too far down the rabbit hole on Purepost, because we spent 5 years creating the world's largest proprietary database of translated competencies and skills, you, me, military, civilian, anyone can go onto our platform for free, for life, and create an online profile. Think of it as like a LinkedIn profile that will do two things. One, it'll instantly translate anything that you've done to your underlying competencies and skills. And then secondly, instantly match you with any open employment opportunity for which you're a fit in the U.S. economy on that basis. It's a very unique way of matching, nothing else like it in the market at the moment, and it enables some incredible things as an individual. Because you get a better quality match, you're going to enable yourself to have better career upward mobility and better personal fulfillment. At an organizational level, again, because you have an optimal match, you're going to realize greater retention rates, and at scale and over time, you realize greater productivity and competitiveness as well. So all incredibly important things, and that's why I'm focused where I'm at.
So the Purepost, it's available to civilians as well as veterans?
Anybody and everybody.
Oh,
For free
wow.
for life. Go on, create we call it a passport. Create your passport for free. It'll take you about 15 minutes. Translate what you've done and match you with job openings.
Well, that's really good, because I know not just the vets, but I know that civilians and almost anybody, really, even students out of college, they have all these experiences. They may be very diverse, and they are looking to break into a field, but they don't know what those transferable skills are that they may have. So I guess you're putting, what is it, an algorithm behind figuring it out and matching. So doing it the smart way.
I'll just say I'm not the tech person in the organization. There's all sorts of tech stack programs and algorithms, and you name it. I couldn't speak to that in any amount of detail, so I'll defer to others on that.
Well, it sounds really.
I just
really
know
cool,
it works.
That's
I
awesome.
just know it works. Yeah.
I'm sure it's better than LinkedIn, because LinkedIn is just like, I don't know how many actual networking opportunities, or a lot of it seems scammy these days. And it's also very inauthentic. And then there's that social component where you're forced to sort of say congratulations to everybody. And it's just, I think it deviates from the mission of getting somebody employed. It kind of goes into that social media realm and all of those negative things that could, come with as well. So it's great that there's a better option for people, and especially one that is not only welcoming but encouraging of vets. I think that's remarkable. So why is it that some vets have trouble getting employment after they've served? Is it simply because they don't know those transferable skills, or uh, is there still a stigma about vets that some employers may have?
It's probably a combination of those things. First, when you consider members of the military, they tend to enlist at a very young age, such that by the time they ultimately leave the military is all they've done pretty much in their entire adult lives, unless they've had think of it as a summer job during high school, let's say. They would not have worked in what I'll call the real world. And so they would not have had experience doing things like creating a resume, conducting an interview, everything that all of us in the real world experience anytime we've gone and tried to apply for a job. And more than that, the longer that they're in, and frankly, the more intense the experience they've had in the military, the more difficult it tends to be to make that transition. They're ingrained, they're socialized, I'll use that word, to a military culture, a way of living. It is a way of life. It is 24/7, 365. And when they leave the military, it is a stark change along a number of dimensions, all of which I document in my books. In the experience changes along all of those dimensions simultaneously. It is a whirlwind for the individual if they're not prepared. And that's why I encourage them in my books to start up to 2 years ahead of time before they leave, to start to think through who they are, who they want to be, and begin to put the plan in place, how they move from point A in the military to point B in the real world, again, with my specific focus around employment. So there's definitely issues on the military side of the divide, and that's what the first book tries to address and help individuals. But to the other point, there's all sorts of misinformation on the outside of the military from employers. Again, I'll focus there, and understanding or not understanding who veterans are, what they bring to the table. There's all sorts of myths that have percolated over the years that need to be overcome. And the realization needs to be made that if you want to take advantage of what these veterans are absolutely bringing to the table, and we get into skills translation and all of those things that pose a challenge again for both sides of the divide. But the employers need to optimize this talent pool, meet these folks halfway, and that's what the second book helps prove as well. If it would be helpful in answering this question, as you know, I like to share slides and materials. Would love to bring up some of those myths and give
Oh,
you
absolutely.
a sense of how we can debunk them.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I love that you come with receipts. You always have you have evidence, and it's your books are filled with evidence and evidence-based practice. So this is very
Yeah,
good.
lots of materials here. I'll start off the top just by saying, and again, I base everything in studies and facts and figures. The studies here from Institute for Veterans and Military Families demonstrate what the true business value of veterans are, and your viewers can read here. I won't read, but HR managers say that. I'm pointing to the bubbles on the right-hand side. Survey upon survey shows that veterans are promoted faster, perform better, and are easier to manage than their non-veteran peers. That's not to create an us versus them dynamic. It's simply stating a fact. But let's get into what some of those myths are, and I'll try to run through these quickly. One myth out there is that veterans are less educated than their civilians. Well, let's look at a couple different measuring sticks. If you look at high school degree, veterans by 6% have a greater preponderance of having a high school degree. If we look beyond high school, say a graduate or other advanced degree, veterans are 160% more likely to have a graduate or other advanced degree, and veterans with bachelor's degrees have 3 times more work experience than non-veterans. And again, here's the the studies and the facts to back that up, this chart documents, and I've circled there, the typical ranks, the times at which individuals tend to depart the service. That's what employers are typically looking at, folks within that circle, if you will. But what this chart does is compare the experience and the training and the education that members of the military have had vis-a-vis their civilian equivalents. And when you stack that up and compare to the number of people supervised and the amount of training that they've had, members of the military have a broad and very deep experience, education, training that in many times exceeds the civilian equivalent. Here's a great myth that people in the civilian world, they watch a lot of war movies or what have you. They think everyone's, as I call it, a trigger puller, meaning served in a combat capacity. Fact of the matter is less than 15% have done so. Now, I was one of those. I was an armor officer. I served on tanks and shot big bullets downrange for fun. But, and therefore I, as someone in a combat specialty, had to reinvent myself a little bit more so than some others. But getting back to the point here, if I flip that around, 85% of individuals that serve in the military serve in an occupational specialty that is immediately accredited to a civilian equivalent, and pick your organization. And you can see that the specialties here on the left side of the chart. And that's not to say that the service members, because they served in that capacity in the military, have to serve in that way in the civilian world. In fact, only about half of them end up doing. The point is that they have training and skills and experience in that would be immediately applicable to their civilian equivalent. Another one is around PTSD. And without spending a lot of time here, the myth is that all veterans are broken and they all have PTSD, certainly much more so than their civilian peers. Fact of the matter is, if you take a notional organization here, I just use a notional 1,000-person organization, there's 5 times more civilians in your organization that have PTSD versus the veterans. Now, that sounds crazy, but let me just quickly run you through the math. If we assume that 6% of your labor pool are veterans, which is what studies show, then in that notional 1,000-person organization, you got 60 vets. Studies also show that post 9/11 veterans, which typically the talent pool you're going to be hiring from, anywhere between 11 and 20% of those have PTSD. If we take what I'll call it the conservative end of that range, the 20% applied to the 60, that gives you 12 employees that are veterans that have PTSD. So let's look at the flip side. 1,000 minus 60 is 940. Civilians also get PTSD. Think automobile accidents, sexual trauma, what have you, lots of reasons why people succumb to PTSD. 7 to 8% of the US population has that. Let's take the low end of that range, apply it to the 740, and that gives you 66, more than 5 times the amount there. There's another myth around the military not being very diverse. The fact is, not only do you get success with the military, I'll show you some stats on that in a moment, 31% come from ethnic and racial minorities. Again, facts. Question here about, again, all veterans being broke, all veterans being disabled, and thus requiring accommodations. Again, it's not true. Most don't require disability accommodations, and 58% of them cost nothing. Some myths here around a common complaint I get from employers: I can't find veterans. I would like to hire them, but I have no way of finding them. Well, fact of the matter is, veterans are real-time talent play, and in many cases, as I demonstrated with occupational specialties, a plug-and-play asset. Fact of the matter is, there's 200,000 matriculating from the service annually. They're available year-round, unlike folks coming off of academic campuses. And chapter 6 of Hiring Veterans spends an entire chapter walking through literally hundreds of avenues by which you can access that talent. So they're readily available. Another myth out there is, why should I? It really has no bottom line or top line impact on my business. Again, facts are anything but the case. First, consider that the military community, I use that term broadly, comprises 37 million folks that wield 1.2 trillion in buying power. And those that are wise enough to utilize this talent pool have a diverse employee population that includes veterans. They realize a 22% increase in productivity, 13 times higher mean cash flow, 4 times more able to deal with personnel problems, and 3 times more likely to identify and build leaders. Very impactful top and bottom line. Last one I'll touch on here is, again, another thing I hear from employers. Why should I bother? It really has no impact at the end of the day. Beyond the top and bottom line impacts that I just mentioned, if that weren't enough, it directly and palpably impacts national security. If I think about, if I'm a 16 or 17-year-old kid out there and I'm considering enlisting in the military, if I don't see veterans coming out of the military having successful employment outcomes, why would I raise my right hand and enlist? And in fact, that's exactly what's going on right now. Every single service, with the exception of the Marine Corps, has missed their recruiting goals 2 years in a row. So much so that the Army has had to physically shrink the size of its force. And so
wow.
it's a direct impact to national security. Even more to the point, if veterans aren't employed, guess who pays the unemployment bill? It's the Department of Defense. And those funds come directly out of DoD's operating budget, taking money directly away from funds that would otherwise be spent training the troops, and again, buffeting our national security. It's a direct, quantifiable impact to the nation's security. So I'll leave it at that. Long-winded answer to the question, but those tend to be the kinds of things that folks don't realize or perhaps think otherwise about.
I mean, those are really talk about myth busting. I mean, especially when it comes to the idea of PTSD and, all of that. That's very eye-opening, because unfortunately media does have, a influence on how people see vets or their, and unfortunately there's not a lot of people who have served like there was in the past. So I'm sure many people have never even encountered, a veteran to know the difference. And so that's unfortunate too. So it's why what you're doing is so important, to just, bust those myths. I thought about you the other day. I went to a place called Mission Barbecue. I don't know if you're familiar with that place. Do you have them around where you are located?
There are. Yeah, they tend to have a deuce-and-a-half truck out front.
Yeah, they have that here too. I wasn't familiar, and I know they have a franchise, but it's not necessarily everywhere. I don't know that it's regional, but I love what they're doing. And like I said, I went there for the first time actually, and I thought, oh wow, here's a good example. I mean, it's a little, excessive in their view of it, but I guess somebody has to do it, right? And boy, you can really tell the difference in the quality. And so that's a shout out to Mission Barbecue, not a paid sponsor, but I would sponsor Mission Barbecue in exchange for their brisket. So if you hear that, Mission Barbecue, but yeah, so it's really great when employers focus on doing what it is that they can do. But when we think of employers and that, I think sometimes it's easy to think about like big corporations and companies. But, small businesses, I think really could benefit from having that sort of candidate come in who has this different mindset about, reaching a mission, and, the education that they bring and the experience and that adaptability too, because entrepreneurs and small business people, they have to often wear many hats, and they face different and unique challenges. And it's not, it's not quite the same as a large company. And so in your experience, have you seen that small businesses benefit from vets, or is it more of a larger organization?
Oh, it's across the board. And you hit on a key point. I'll circle back to the U.S. Chamber study that they did. The most recent one uncovered that, first of all, understand that small businesses, the way the U.S. Chamber defines it, makes up 99.5% of the businesses in the country. Their study uncovered that 90% of these businesses, again, 90% of 99.5% of the businesses in the country, do not specifically hire veterans. And they're responsible for 42% of the new jobs created in the country every year.
Oh,
So
wow.
it's a huge missed opportunity for reasons that we just talked about. And we can get more in depth on the value that veterans bring to the table. And that's purposely why I included case studies in hiring veterans on two smaller organizations, Performance Contractors and Cajun Industries, who are both down in the Gulf region, but both of whom have successfully put programs in place to enable the use of this incredibly valuable talent pool. And both of them, just to highlight kind of the key things that they did to enable success, And in general, this would apply to, frankly, any business. One, they ensure that they had top-down support from, in their case, as a small business, from the CEO, who either was a veteran or was very familiar with the veterans and who they are, what they could do. And then beyond that top-down support, both talking the talk and walking the talk in terms of financial and other resources to enable the program. They brought in folks to manage it on more or less a full-time basis, and those folks did two things that are parts of the keys to success. One is they created what I'll call a tribe, a peer set within those organizations. Typically takes the form of a business resource group, or call it a veteran business resource group. And that enables that peer set to come together and to thrive. And lots of books out there explain the importance of having that tribe in place. First, just from a very practical standpoint within those organizations, that tribe enables bandwidth and a group of people from which you can pool to help with the program. That's probably, from someone running these programs, that's the biggest advantage to pulling them together. But there's all sorts of other benefits that accrue to the rest of that talent pool, that peer set, and the organization itself. So that's one, put the BRG in place. And I would do it in this order. Make sure you got the support, put the BRG in place. And then the next point would be ensure that there is a mentoring program that accompanies the onboarding, training, and assimilation process that needs to take place. Now, why that's important is because it engages those new veteran hires with someone more senior in the organization. Typically, yes, there's a buddy mentoring process that would occur within that tribe, but I'm talking more of a senior to more junior mentoring program. So in doing so, it connects someone that spent a lot of time in that organization, can speak to the dynamics of that culture, what it takes to succeed in that organization, ensure that those new hires understand that and can thus put their goals in place personally and professionally as soon as they get in the door. And then they would follow up in very short fashion and consistently with feedback, certainly within the first year. We want to stretch that out such that there's regular touch points within the first 2 years, because studies show if you're able to keep a veteran fully employed in that organization for 2 years, you're much more likely to retain them thereafter.
So you offer clear steps in the book on how an employer can do this. So if somebody were to say have a small business, and let's say it's very small, say they just open a bakery, or they have some sort of a HVAC service or something that would be a startup, and they have it in their mind that I would like to give back. I would like to do my part in giving back, but also they understand the importance of the skills that the veterans bring with them, but they're just a little unsure of what to do. And they've heard all those myths, and then they just, I don't even know where to find a vet, and so that person, if they picked up your book, it wouldn't be like, well, that'd be good for corporate. But no, it would be something that average person who is a small business owner would be able to look at those steps and say, I think I see a pathway here of how I would be able to bring someone aboard.
No, it's exactly right. I'm going to go back to sharing my screen again. What they'll see when they pick up the book, I'll blow this up a little bit so everyone can see. This is exactly what they'll see. This is the process on which the book is based and how the chapters evolve. Just like the first book, I described the first book as crawl, walk, run, step 1, 2, 3, written purposefully that way because that's exactly the way that members of the military are trained. And so I kind of mimic that same approach here, but for application in the corporate space. Wow. And without getting into too much detail on the chart itself, obviously there needs to be a decision made up front that you're going to commit to support hiring these veterans and put a program in place, which entails the top-down support that I mentioned. And then from there, it gets into the balance of the process, first of which is understanding. And you talked about what steps they should take. There's a voluminous chapter up front helping them identify the nature of the various dimensions of military culture, and then compare contrast that with the dimensions of their own culture. And there's stereotypical determinants or characterizations of cultures in smaller organizations versus larger organizations, kind of give them a sense of the range or the spectrum of cultures that are out there. So that it's key to organize that. In parallel, you can organize and staff the program itself. Those folks will help you create the content, begin from a branding, a marketing standpoint, begin to set expectations internally and externally. And then having done all that, you can start to actually go out and begin to recruit, and after identifying those candidates, and it proceeds fairly lockstep from there. Once you're engaged, how to engage with them. There's specific process for doing so, specific way in doing so, such that you uncover their competencies versus what are traditional interview questions. And then, standard HR process around finalizing offer, make sure you've got the onboarding processes in place. And then importantly, following up after ensuring these folks are properly deployed, make sure they get the feedback they need, and you can measure your success. And not to downplay that last point, but and this would apply to a veteran hiring initiative, or frankly, any hiring initiative, any program, frankly, that any organization should undertake. At the end of the day, there should be a return on this investment, because it will take an investment up front. And I encourage you to measure that and hold the leaders of these programs accountable. At the end of the day, this should be moving the needle in whatever way that you're going to match the metrics of this program with the metrics of the organization. My argument is always they should be directly linked from a cause and effect standpoint.
So this isn't about just charity. So, some people want to
No.
do what's right, and and it's good, and it is a good, motive, but it's more about recognizing the value that these veterans bring and being willing to invest in them, because it's really an investment in yourself and your business, not something that's just nice to do.
It's well said. And I state that right up front in the introduction. This is not about patriotism. This is not about waving the flag. I encourage all organizations to view this opportunity selfishly. At the end of the day, because of what these folks bring to the table, it should be moving the needle on your top and bottom line, and addressing whatever the needs are of your stakeholders, your shareholders, depending on your for-profit or nonprofit. That's exactly right.
Have you noticed a difference in success rates in for-profit or nonprofit? And is there any that work better, or maybe not so much? Or is it pretty equal?
Pretty equal, I would say. I have, in terms of case studies and exposure, I have more exposure on the for-profit side. But interestingly, veterans, because of their background and what they've done in the military, are shown. And I'm not going to be accurate on the precise things that they're focused in on. I'll summarize it by saying that, the whole time that they've been in the military, the veterans have been focused on the mission of the organization and how they contribute to the overall good. When you wake up in the military every day, that the purpose that you're serving the flag in the form of, your military assignment, your command, your unit, what higher calling could there be? And that it's part of the real struggle that they have in making their way to the real world. And that's part of the first book, in helping them find their purpose in the new world. Interestingly, to the point of your question, veterans tend, because of that experience, tend to have a greater affinity towards, nonprofits, because they have a similar mission-driven purpose within those organizations. Veterans are sometimes turned off by commercial entities and their focus on the tops and bottom lines, and everything being about making money. But that's kind of what that is. And not to go too far down this path, but for veterans to adjust effectively in those organizations, need to see beyond that, and to what extent the mission, the purpose that they serve within that organization is not just driving them making the money, but how are they serving their customer base, and one way, shape, or form. And I tell my own story in the first book as to how I found my way through to that. But anyway, nonprofit is one of those spaces. Another one, interestingly, is in entrepreneurial spaces. And I'm in the process of writing some additional articles on this for various publications. Veterans, as a percentage basis, uh, tend to have a greater preponderance of those beginning businesses these days. And depending on what kind of metric you use, they may, I'll say that, with italics, they may be more successful than their peers. There's still a lot of data out being assessed right now, but some of the dynamics, again, cultural dynamics, dimensions, tend in some instances to align more better with smaller, more entrepreneurial organizations than larger, more bureaucratic organizations. When you think about what people were asked to do in the military, to adjust fire, adapt and overcome, and pivot on a dime to make things happen, and having the freedom to do so, that's in many times what an entrepreneurial environment looks like. Versus
Absolutely.
a larger, more bureaucratic organization, you tend to feel like a bit of a cog in the machine. Many times a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of meetings that don't seem to make a lot of progress. And so that, to some members of the military community, can be a bit of a turnoff.
Hmm. That's really interesting because I think some people look at military service as being a cog in a machine, particularly if you're, maybe not higher up or doing something. So I think the image might be, if you're a soldier, then you're just out there sort of mindlessly taking commands and not worrying about the bottom line of what you're actually doing. And I know there's a lot of misconceptions, and so to think of, somebody in that position moving from that to something that could be more administrative or more, say, professional in that regard, it might not be a clear pathway that the employer sees. So I'm interested in actually your story too. You mentioned, that you served in a capacity that you were in a tank. I think you mentioned something like that. So maybe a more stereotypical vision of what it would mean to serve to some people. But then here you go, and you have this, great career in consulting, and you're working, in like tech startup, and you're doing all these amazing things. I was that an easy transition, or did that take a lot of work? I know it took a lot of work, but I mean, did it take a lot of personal work, or was it easy?
Oh, sure. It took a lot of work for sure, a lot of self-reflection. I began, as context, and I'm going to betray my age here in answering this question, but I left active duty way back in the mid 90s. This was in the midst of Clinton drawdown years. I was an armor officer, so think tanks. Um, and in that time frame, realizing that the first Gulf War peace dividend, as they call it, they're in a process of shrinking the force. Budgets were severely constrained. In organizations like mine, where you're moving big equipment that costs a lot of money to move around, we were literally locked in. You couldn't roll your tank out the back gate and do training that, obviously I, as an officer, or anyone in my unit that I commanded, really enlisted to go and do. It wasn't a lot of fun, and there wasn't much on the horizon that would indicate that was going to change anytime soon. That affected my decision to get out. The other factor was I got married, and my wife was in medical school, and I realized that for me to remain in the military was going to take me one path, and her being a physician was going to take her another path. And by the time I got out, we'd been married for 2 years, but had yet to live together. And I just saw that, again, if I'd have stayed in, that would have continued. So those two things really swung my decision to get out. I recognized early on enough that I, again, undertook some self-reflection. There was really little to no support mechanisms at the time. Today, there's things like TAP and Skill Bridge, which are helpful, but still not entirely meeting the need. I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but there's lots to say there. What I did, necessity being mother of invention, is utilize what resources were available. For me, What Color's Your Parachute, book by Dick Bowles, was exceptionally helpful for me as a basis. And I started digesting that and applying that easily a year ahead before getting out. And so I discovered a couple things about myself. One was, if I wanted to end up where I thought I was wanting to go in the real world, I needed some time to adjust. I needed to upskill myself. And so I saw, for me, graduate school as an effective transition vehicle. And so that's ultimately what I did. Spent 2 years full-time earning my MBA, which enabled me to do a couple things. One, rub elbows with those that had been working in the real world their entire lives, and I could glean some lessons learned from them. Two, it enabled me to upskill, as I said, learn a new skill set, get via some internships, what I call boots on the ground, actual
Mm.
experience in the real world before setting foot in it full time. So it was incredibly useful a period of time for me. Ultimately settled in the real world. Initially at Procter and Gamble. After a few years, moved from there to General Electric, and then on to Deloitte for 18 years, from which I retired a couple of years ago, joining as president of Purepost. But that was, you asked about my story. That's kind of the short story how I got there. Um, it wasn't easy. It didn't come without a lot of work. Um,
That's a lot of
I'll
work.
leave it at that, and let you dive in further in various areas if you'd like.
No, that is definitely a lot of work. It might sound daunting to some people too. Is that so? That definitely influenced you on the first book. So guiding people through that process, since it was something that you sort of took on yourself. But if somebody were out there and they thought, "Wow, I'm trying to transition," maybe they, are a vet and they are spending time. I'm thinking of someone in particular who I know. Maybe they're a vet and they're currently working at, say, McDonald's, or some sort of job where they know that they just had to get some work right now, but they know that they bring all of these amazing skills and that they could do better. You clearly they should sign up for Purepost, because then they could see those transferable skills. But aside from that, maybe if graduate school is not a question, or maybe they should go to school, how would they even know what the next step would be? I know
Well,
you mentioned something about, taking a break, and that's intriguing. So maybe you could hit on that
if you're financially able
if you're
to.
able to. Correct.
Most people aren't. So what I'd recommend is just taking advantage of time in the margins, as it were,
Hmm.
as it were, either ahead of your shift or nights and weekends. And that, frankly, that's really how I wrote the first book, uh,
Mm.
and nights and weekends. But what I would tell them, one, you mentioned Purepost, and that's exactly where I'm going to go down, is to take advantage of that passport, because not only, let's use your McDonald's shift worker as an example. Not only do they bring with them a ton of competencies and skills from their time in the military, they've likewise built upon that via their experience as a McDonald's shift worker. When you think of what they do, they're undoubtedly interfacing with others, may even be supervising some people as part of the store. They're undoubtedly interfacing with customers, so they're understanding what customer support is, which in this day and age is critical. You're literally on the front lines with those that are providing you the revenue you need as a business to succeed. Uh, my point is, if you go into Purepost, create a passport, it will uncover instantly what all of those competencies and skills are. What I always find fascinating is watching a veteran do this, and one, seeing what they are, because they typically haven't understood that, yes, I did that and I can do this. But more importantly than that, understanding where and how that applies in the real world, because those competencies and skills that they didn't realize they had opens the door to entirely new career paths that they previously hadn't considered. And to
Hmm.
see them look at the job matches after they've done the translation, completed their profile, their eyes tend to get big. Oh, yeah, you're right. I guess I could do that. And again, things that they hadn't considered. Now they need to do some homework and networking to validate these hypotheses, but it opens paths where previously there had been none.
And I think sometimes people don't just generally speaking, people don't realize the types of jobs that are available because they're named things that may be pretty obscure. They're not, when you're a kid, you're asked, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And you can say, "I want to be a fireman," or whatever. It's something very archetypal. Nobody says, "I want to be a scrum master," or, somebody who's in logistics, or, but those are really great opportunities. And
Yeah,
there's so many jobs that don't have fancy titles, but can
yeah,
offer a lot of opportunity for somebody. And so it might be interesting to see
yeah.
when people sign up that, hey, there's some, avenues that I might be able to
Well, another
pursue.
example I'll throw out real quickly. We just signed with Uber. Think about what an Uber driver does every day, right around. And yeah, this would be an opportunity for a veteran coming out if nothing else panned out for them. But when you consider what an Uber driver has to do on a day in day basis to hustle, one,
Hmm.
and interface with customers every time that they're engaged in providing someone a ride. Again, there's all these underlying competencies and skills that they gain through this experience that they can parlay into other things.
Well, let me tell you, I am usually not really interested in using an Uber for fear. If I knew that my Uber driver had served, and I think that would change my mind completely. I'd feel a lot better, you know. So they should advertise that they're doing that, because that would really, I think, make people feel at ease.
That,
So
that's a great point.
yeah.
I'll bring that up with them.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, as a female, maybe going alone, if I knew that there was a vet who was driving me around, I'd say, okay, we're safe, we're good. You can handle any kind of problem that might arise. So, but no, that's great. So that's it sounds like you have really great advice for somebody at the, maybe beginning level all the way up to, maybe the end of their search. But then on that flip side, how you have the two books, I think that's just what I love is your effort to try to close this gap. You're living up to that mission, because with the one book, you're addressing the one side of the gap, and now the new book, you're addressing the other. I mean, you've really thought of it all.
Well, it comes from my background as a consultant, one, two, just my natural proclivity as an operator and efficiency and trying to address things holistically. And so that's why I've attacked the problem, again, the civil military divide, as I have, to holistically get at that. Would it be helpful? We've talked about civil military divide. Would it help you viewers to better understand what I mean when I use that term?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think we clarified. So, yeah, but I
Yeah.
don't think that people realize that there is that strong of a divide. So I think it would be helpful.
Okay. So I'm going to go back to my show and tell here with my slides. So I'll rapidly blow through a few slides, but just to define for your viewers, your listeners, what we're talking about. So the definition, call it a gap, call it a divide. It's this divide between the nation and those who serve her. It's characterized by issues among multiple dimensions. You see them there, driven by root causes and exacerbated by, frankly, opinions on both sides of the divide. But what it drives is a fundamental disconnect between what veterans expect of employers and vice versa. So let me throw some statistics at that. First, veterans make up less than 0.5% of the US population they did a generation ago, and that trend is continuing downward. So much so that by the 2040s or so, it'll be a third less than the 7.3% it is today. Let's look at Congress and veteran representation in Congress. That's at an historic low as well. Let's look at veterans in the workforce. More than half of veterans are beyond retirement age, if I consider 65 to be a retirement age. And depending on what level you're looking at in the organization, less than about 2.5% of senior leaders in large publicly held corporations have any military experience whatsoever. So if I flip that around, there's a 97+% chance the person sitting across the desk from me has no idea who I am, what I've done, what I can do. So again, lack of understanding, lack of familiarity. If you simply look at where veterans live vis-a-vis the balance of the population, that tends not to overlap. You looking at the heat maps to the right side of this slide.
Mm.
And so you've got, as we covered before, 200,000 folks coming out from the military every year. 70% of them are short of a retirement without a pension, and half of them saying that they're not prepared for the transition. We talked about earlier the small businesses, but Korn Ferry also surveyed large businesses, 80% of whom don't have veteran-specific hiring programs. So, put all of that together, what we end up with more veterans coming out, entering a nation whose elected leaders don't represent them, corporate leaders don't include them, population doesn't look like them or live nearby them, and employers don't understand, and for which they're unprepared. Employers, while there's all sorts of incentives out there, from work opportunity tax credits, et cetera, they typically don't have programs to identify, hire, train, or retain the vets, and they face the cost of justifying this for an ever-shrinking minority of their workforce, and assuming you're a for-profit organization in the face of constantly shrinking budgets. What all of this drives at the end of the day, and this is not a happy story, more than half of vets, post 9/11 vets, which is basically those in the workforce today, they're going to be unemployed on an average of 22 weeks. Almost 2/3 will not be in their chosen career field, and they'll job hop and job hop and job hop, so much so that by their sixth post-military job, half of them still aren't in their preferred career field. And to add insult to injury, the suicide rate among this population has more than doubled within the better part of the past decade. So that's when I talk about the civil military gap, that's what it is. That's how it's characterized. And that's what I'm trying to help close with a specific focus on employment to enable it.
Wow. Well, I think you're definitely not only talking the talk, but walking the talk in the way that you've approached this and, devoted essentially your career to this. I mean, because this comes from a very personal place of experience and you sharing that experience with others. It's so important. And I'm so grateful that you, have brought this information. I hope that people hear this and on either side of that divide, if they're a veteran, that they can say, hey, you know what? There's something I can do here. There's a couple things. One, you could clearly get the book. I mean, that's important, but then also go on to Purepost and check it out and sign up for the passport. That's there's no commitment. It doesn't cost anything. You can just do it and see, hey, what other avenues could I explore, with my experience? And then two, if you're an employer, if you have a big business or even a small business, now you have a path. There's no excuse. You can pick up this book and the new book, and you can look at, as you clearly saw in the PowerPoints, you can see there is a path that's laid out for you on how you can hire a veteran, not as charity, although it is a good thing to do. It's a moral and ethical thing to do. But more importantly, you're going to get a big bang for your buck. You're going to get an ROI that may surprise you. And so I think that this is a very good discussion that we've had. And I'm so grateful that you were able to bring this information on. And I mean, bring the information too, with all the statistics and evidence-based information.
No, my pleasure. It is a win-win-win value
Yeah.
proposition. It's obviously helping the veterans when you bring them on. It's helping your organization in turn, especially when you bring on these folks at scale. And as we covered, it's going to help the nation overall. So you almost can't lose.
Yeah.
If you do it in an organized fashion, and I stand ready to support that. I'll add one other resource to your earlier list, which is my website. Whether you're a veteran or an organization, you will find voluminous resources out there to augment both books. Specifically for the individual veterans, there's a series of courses, video courses, and an e-course, a voluminous workbook out there to help you work through the first book. So please take advantage, all for free for life as well. And the website, by the way, is matthewjlewis.com. Lewis is in St. Louis.
Awesome. That's great. Well, before I let you go, I'm going to throw you a curveball question here that's completely off topic, but my audience would probably be very upset if I didn't take the opportunity to ask you your thoughts on the UFOs, or the UAPs as they're now called. Do you believe that there have been sightings, or, I mean, clearly people have been saying they are seeing things and we don't know that they're aliens and whatnot, but what are your thoughts on the UAP situation?
So I absolutely believe, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist, and I've never personally experienced it myself, but that doesn't mean I don't believe. And without betraying sources, I can tell you that I've got close secondhand experience with those that have, that I know well and trust. So I definitely believe it's there. I'm unclear as to what that means for us collectively, and it does instill a bit of fear. On the other hand, my other thought is, what can I really do about it?
Right.
So I'm kind of left to live my life as it is, as best I can. But I'm a definite believer for sure.
Do you think, I mean, this may seem like a silly question, but do you personally think it is an issue of national security?
It potentially is. I have no idea what the intention is of these other beings, these other entities. To date, and I could be wrong, but to date, I don't think there's been anything that has proven them to be a direct threat. What I do know from what I've read and been exposed to is there tends to be sightings around said nuclear facilities or military facilities. For whatever reason, they tend to coalesce in those areas. Not sure why. Not sure what that means for us downrange in terms of potential threats. There's far smarter people than I in the Pentagon that hopefully are being paid to figure that out.
Hopefully. Hopefully they figure it out, and hopefully they give us a heads up.
Yeah.
I think we should have a heads up on these matters. I understand the need for some secrecy, but it'd be good to have a warning before we have some sort of invasion.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, thank you again, Matt. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about these important issues, and you're welcome to come on anytime.
My pleasure, Heather. Thank you again for having me, and I look forward to future conversations.
Thank you. You as well. This episode of the Midnight Academy is sponsored by you, the audience. As we embark on this first season, we're refining our approach to deliver top-tier content and spark enriching conversations. By subscribing to our YouTube channel or podcast, you're helping to foster a community of thinkers, dreamers, and explorers. For those seeking more, consider becoming a paid subscriber. Your financial support helps us deliver better quality content, insightful discussions, and bonus material, turning the Midnight Academy from a budding podcast into a groundbreaking platform and community where we bridge the gap between knowledge and belief. There are still many things that can be done to improve the quality of the show and your experience, so please visit our website to learn more about subscribing and stay tuned for more details in upcoming episodes.